Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Julia Friedlander. I'm the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics program. And today, together with ACAMS, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion on financial resilience, the future of secondary sanctions, and global response. We're honored to welcome Mairead McGuinness, European Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability, and Capital Markets Union, for a keynote on EU financial sector stability and resilience, including, of course, sanctions policy, followed by a panel discussion with former Undersecretary of the Treasury, Adam Zubin, who's now of counsel at Sullivan and Cromwell, Justine Walker, head of sanctions, in this conversation, discussing financial sector stability and, of course, the use of international markets as a point of leverage and also is a part of our foreign policy. If anything, the last year has shown us that global markets are integrated more than ever, and we are interconnected more than ever. So with that in mind, I'm as part of the Zoom program that you're all accustomed to, and we'll get to you through the course of the conversation. So, Madam Commissioner, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm really honored to be part of the distinguished panel. And as you say, to take part in the conversation. And that's what today is about. It's light is fading here in Brussels. I think it's more noon with you. But spring is, I suppose, giving us all hope that when COVID eases, life may return to some form of normality. As you say, this topic is really, really important. Financial markets are global, and therefore global cooperation is, in my view, absolutely vital. If you look at the regulatory agenda after the global financial crisis, it was about addressing excesses in the marketplace, imbalances, and climate change. The context in which we look at financial markets and indeed financial regulation is changing. We're, if you like, searching for effective means to respond to challenges and to counter threats. In this context, finance is increasingly a powerful instrument of action. If you like, it's an enabler of change. As you said, I'm the EU Commissioner responsible for financial services, and that responsibility includes financial stability and financial integration, but also the implementation of EU sanctions policy. And financial sanctions are increasingly part of the financial services policy agenda. Europe and the US have a significant shared history. And indeed, my home county is County Louth in Ireland, and I was very pleased in 2016 to meet the then Vice President, now President Joe Biden, and it was a trip and a visit I remember with great fondness. The EU and the US share common values too, which is the most important aspect of our cooperation. The transatlantic partnership continues to be extremely important for the European Union, and I really want to stress that this evening. In December, we put forward a proposal for a new European-US agenda for global change to renew our alliance. And in that paper, we proposed action to fight the pandemic, to tackle climate change, to cooperate on technology, on trade and standards, and support democratic values. The EU's commitment to multilateralism is unwavering, and transatlantic relations must be a cornerstone of our work globally. In that respect, I was really pleased to hear Secretary Yellen emphasizing the American commitment to multilateralism when addressing global challenges. In financial services, we have a very good track record of cooperation with the US, particularly since the early 2000s. And since 2016, our cooperation has taken the form of a very focused, results-oriented and successful regulatory forum. And I look forward to working with Treasury Secretary Yellen and President Biden's administration in a number of areas under my responsibility. So first, on climate change and sustainable finance. We need stronger transatlantic cooperation to support cross-border green investments and contribute to scaling up sustainable finance globally. We're pleased that President Biden has recommitted the United States to the Paris Agreement. The US will be at COP26, and the US will take part in the relevant G20 and FSB work on sustainable finance as well. We hope to work more closely together on disclosures, and that the US will take a greater interest in green taxonomies. Then technology and data policies will certainly be a major topic for our transatlantic regulatory discussion. There is already a lot of cooperation on cyber resilience of financial institutions and infrastructures, and we look forward to further engagement with the US on cross-border aspects. Crypto assets and stable coins, very much in the news at the moment, are another area where closer work would be mutually beneficial. And on the fight against money laundering, the US has just passed a significant reform of beneficial ownership and are supportive of our work on reforming the EU anti-money laundering framework. And we look forward to closer cooperation in the Financial Action Task Force. So our relationship with the US is vital, and we hope our regulatory cooperation over the coming years will be fruitful. But we should not be naive about the global geopolitical situation. We live in an increasingly multipolar world. Countries acting unilaterally and departing from multilateralism can be disruptive, prioritizing short-term interests over international cooperation and strategic common interests. The European Union wants to maintain the rules-based multilateralism that has served the global economy well. Indeed, the EU is itself a very successful example of multilateralism in action, of sovereign countries choosing to work together on a daily basis. But we depend on the resilience of our economic and financial system. It needs to be able to withstand internal and external shocks. And this means taking a long, hard look at vulnerabilities in our economic and financial system, identifying them and addressing them through targeted structural measures. That means protecting ourselves from external impacts and practices with unfair repercussions for EU operators and which undermine EU policies. So to that end, in January, the Commission adopted a communication that implements the concept of open strategic autonomy in finance, ensuring openness, strength, and resilience. Council President Michel spoke about this concept last week here at the Atlantic Council, and it aims to increase resilience, to decrease dependence, and to increase influence. The European Union is America's ally. A stronger, more resilient, and more robust European financial system can be beneficial to the United States and to our common objectives. If both sides are stronger, it will reinforce the transatlantic alliance, including in finance. So more concretely, the new European Union paper proposes actions in three specific areas. So first is a strengthened international role of the euro. And this is not a new idea. Rather, it follows from a strategy set out already in 2018. So a global currency system that is more multipolar is, in our view, more stable. Countries are less dependent on liquidity conditions created in or by the United States as a sole provider of a reserve currency. And contrary to much of the media reporting, our ambition is not to compete with the status of the US dollar, which remains the global reserve currency. The euro is a currency of 19 EU member states and over 340 million EU citizens. It is the second most important currency in the world and has the potential to play an even greater role in the international financial system and so enhance the resilience of the European Union economy. A stronger euro requires more resilient underpinnings, and there is much work to be done on our side. We need to deepen and continue the work on economic and monetary union by completing the banking union and developing the capital markets union. And this will lead to deeper and more liquid markets, which will ultimately benefit transatlantic financial integration. A stronger euro and resilient EU economy are beneficial not just for the European Union itself, but also for the United States. The EU could then contribute more to achieve shared goals, such as a resilient international monetary system and a more stable international financial system, making the global economy less vulnerable. And this is the ambition we have. The second area of action is resilient financial market infrastructures. Well-functioning financial infrastructures are key for providing financing and investments for the EU economy, as well as to allow EU businesses and citizens to thrive globally. So in this context, we need to address some risks that have emerged or become visible over the past few years. One element of this is the vulnerability linked to our over-reliance on specific critical infrastructures and financial services providers outside of the European Union. The third element is finally the sanctions policy. Our aim is to improve the implementation and enforcement of the EU's own sanctions regime, while also protecting against the extraterritorial application of sanctions by third countries. And this is not directed at any particular country, but rather it is necessary to increase the EU's credibility as a reliable partner and to maintain the integrity and level playing field of the EU single market. Regarding our own sanctions, the goal is threefold. First, to make sure that our sanctions are smart. They should be effective, but with minimum disruption to the market. Second, we want information on the implementation of sanctions to flow seamlessly between the European Union and its member states. And third, we want to support member states in the uniform implementation of EU sanctions and help business operators navigate obligations and prohibitions in EU law. Specifically on extraterritoriality, we have seen sanctions or other regulatory measures being used more and more by third countries to control the conduct of EU operators. We consider that the extraterritorial application of sanctions by third countries is contrary to international law. These measures threaten the integrity of the single market and the EU's financial system, and they hinder legitimate trade and investment. But there is no silver bullet to remedy this situation. We need to renew our efforts to protect EU operators. We need to make good use of existing tools like the so-called blocking statute, the EU's legal mechanism against extraterritorial sanctions. We should consider whether other tools are needed. And finally, there's no better way to protect against extraterritorial sanctions than to align sanctions implementation with partners like the United States. Indeed, there is evidence that close cooperation with the US and other like-minded countries has helped us deal together with challenges in the past. Many other challenges lie ahead of us. With this communication, the EU wants to show our partners that we are ready to take our share of responsibility for a multilateral world. So in closing, the EU values very much the transatlantic partnership. It is a very high priority for us. And we are already working on renewing it with President Biden's new administration. On financial resilience and sanctions, the two main topics today, I look forward to working with the new US administration. And this is true also of other topics in my area of responsibility, such as sustainable finance, which I touched on, digital finance, and anti-money laundering, as I've just laid out. We can be more effective globally if we work together to achieve our shared aims. Of course, it's not easy to do that, but I think it is now more important than ever. And perhaps the global pandemic, which keeps us apart, should show us how we need to work globally on these questions. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our thoughts with you this evening. I look forward to what will be, I hope, a very engaging conversation and to listening to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your comments. My name is Saleha Mos and I'm with Bloomberg News. I'm here to moderate. Just to kick off with our panelists, which include Adam Zubin and Justine Walker, I'd like to ask the panelists how you see the EU's transatlantic partnership strategy with the US relying on the US and the Biden administration rebuilding and regaining trust from global allies that may have been lost or damaged in the past 4 years.
Saleha, did you want to start with Justine or with me?
I'll ask you, Adam, since you're on screen.
Sure. Well, first, it's a tremendous privilege to be here. Thank you. And thank you to Julia and to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. I think, look, this is a tremendous opportunity for building and strengthening and renewing the transatlantic cooperation, which is going to be key, not just to all of the goals that Commissioner McGuinness set out, but to many of the goals that we've heard from President Biden and from Secretary Blinken that are going to be at the top of their agenda. So whether that's combating corruption, kleptocracy, which President Biden has spoken about as a key agenda topic, whether it's combating national security threats such as Iran, what's going on in Russia right now with the Navalny arrests, whether it's looking to make sure that China is participating in global economy, global commerce as a responsible partner, as a responsible country, I think the transatlantic cooperation is going to be vital across all of those points. And I think, as Commissioner McGuinness said beautifully, we're going to be stronger if we're working together. I think all of the elements are there for much closer cooperation than we've seen over the last 4 years. So that's all on the positive side. That doesn't mean that the cooperation will be easy or seamless. Of course, there are going to be areas where there are different viewpoints. What I think is challenging is 2021 doesn't look like 2015. The world has changed in a number of respects. Certainly Brexit is one part of that. China's posture, I think, is more aggressive than what we saw 5 or 10 years ago. And so the demands on that transatlantic cooperation are going to be higher. On the technology side, and Commissioner McGuinness noted this, you've got an increasing role played by fintech, stable coins, convertible virtual currencies, and even central bank digital currencies that I think are going to call for a lot of smart thinking by regulators in Europe, in the US, in the UK, and also by the private sector.
Thank you. And if I can ask the Commissioner the same question to comment on what you would like to see from President Biden and his cabinet to regain trust that the U.S. is, in fact, ready to take on that multilateral role once again.
Look, I think the word trust, it runs right throughout this. I think you can only have a strong relationship where there's trust. And I think to the point that Adam made about it won't be seamless. But I think if you have a respectful relationship based on trust, you can have the hard conversations without people reacting in a very emotional way. And I think there is a requirement on us to have these tough conversations with the mutual respect that we have. I mean, Adam, you mentioned the many changes since 2015, and sometimes you think, how did all of this happen? And you mentioned Brexit. There have been some quite seismic changes which have a lasting impact. And yet, even with the United Kingdom, no longer part of the European Union, we in the EU will need to have a strong relationship with the United Kingdom, as we need to have with the US, because we have a set of, if you like, shared common values, and we have to find a way of making sure that we work together. As to my expectations of the Biden administration, my first thought is that all of our political systems are overwhelmed by dealing with public health. And I think that is the big priority right now of our leaders. But equally, we have to look afterwards. We have to look beyond this current crisis, if you like, and try and develop a system of cooperation, of challenging each other where we need to do that, and finding solutions. Because whatever the problem is, you know, the prescription is dialogue. We will solve nothing if we bang doors and walk away. I suppose I come from the European Parliament since 2004. I'm relatively recently in the Commission since the end of last year. And the one lesson I learned in the Parliament, which is a huge parliament of voices from all of our member states, is a need to listen and find compromise. And, you know, there were, in the last few years, a sense in which those who compromised were weak. But in fact, those who have the capacity to compromise are the strongest, and they're the ones that will show that leadership, given as what Adam said, that things will not always run smoothly. And I would be worried if they did, because I think there are issues where we have different views or we have, you know, challenge each other, but that's all to the good. I think already, I have to say, our sense is that, and I do not want to speak for the president or his team, but I have a sense in which there is an understanding of the need to rebuild relationships because it gives added value. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to talk about this evening. How do we give added value globally in a world which is full of, you know, complications and troubles and different political agendas? How do we give stability? And even to the long term, which is not that far away, around our climate targets and those objectives which will allow for the world to survive and for our children and their children to have a future. So we face big challenges and big responsibilities.
And if I could just remind our audience who are tuning in that you can send questions through our Zoom chat function. My next question is for Justine to turn our attention toward the private sector a little bit. How do banks and businesses navigate the complicated and often treacherous sanctions programs that are coming out of the US these days?
Well, it's certainly complicated. And I mean, can I just say it's a pleasure to join this very distinguished panel. And, you know, the points which have been brought up are extremely valid. But, you know, as an organization, I mean, we have over 80,000 members operating across the world, all working in the compliance sector. And, you know, they're really looking at, you know, where are the commonalities, where are the uncertainties, what is the process towards implementation? And mean, what I would say is, I think, no matter where you're sitting in the world, we all recognize that countries will define their own foreign policy and sanctions decisions, and where they can cooperate, they will. And even during the last 4 years, we have seen transatlantic cooperation. I think, it is important that there are still many areas where in the sanctions space there has been cooperation, although there's been obviously very big differences around Iran and other regimes as well. But I mean, one of the things I really wanted to highlight, I suppose, in some of the differences that we've seen in the past 4 years, because Adam highlighted that the world does look quite different in 2021 at the moment. And, we've seen a real scaling up of secondary sanctions. And this has had a huge chilling effect, whether you're in China or whether you're in Europe. And, what we've seen here is we've seen that this has been a really effective tool of US policy in many ways, but it's come at a cost. It's a very blunt tool. The implementation of it doesn't have the same governance arrangements that you would see for primary sanctions. So you don't have the same licensing frameworks. It's very difficult to get certain around whether you're operating within acceptable legal parameters if you have some type of nexus to a secondary sanctions risk. So we've seen a lot of change in market attitudes over recent years. We've seen key parts of the world being withdrawn from, but we've also, what I would also say is the expectations around sanctions has increased so much. What was acceptable 7-8 years ago is really now very much the baseline. We're going much further beyond. And if we look at, for example, the China designations and XPCC, a huge global organization designated under human rights sanctions, but literally thousands upon thousands of companies across the world, and trying to establish and navigate this exposure is really, really challenging for the financial sector. So I think really where the financial sector is looking at the moment, or the corporate sector, the global corporate sector, is they're looking at, what is 2021 going to bring? What is the new sanctions policy really going to entail? Where will there be further transatlantic cooperation? Will we see more UN sanctions? Highly unlikely in the current environment. So you're always going to have some tension. We're seeing a real growth of counter sanctions here. We've had the China blocking regulation come out recently. We've had China implementing their own denied parties list. We have, we've had the commissioner talking about a more effective utilization of the EU blocking regulation, and we're already seeing a lot of civil litigation. So, commercial operators now are just trying to navigate a very complex geopolitical scenario. And whilst I think everybody's been very positive that there is going to be transatlantic cooperation, the hope around that, I do see that we're going to have divergence as well. And, now the scenario is, if you're globally operating, how do you manage that diversion? How are you managing the growing US, China diversion, the human rights regimes, which are actually very complex to implement, potentially direction of travel for Russia as well? And, and I think really what's going to be very, very key is what happens with the Iran nuclear deal. If we do see transatlantic cooperation around a next phase of the Iran nuclear deal, I think that will maybe ease some of the wider tensions. But if that can't be reached, then the complexity and the conflicts of law, I believe, is probably going to grow more. And, for commercial operators, it's how do you navigate that?
Justine, you brought up the blocking statute. So if I could press the commissioner actually to talk a little bit about what is behind that, lay it out for us, and also if there's a signaling effect that the EU could benefit from there.
The blocking statute has been around for some time, and it has been used on a number of occasions. There are debates about whether it could be strengthened and its effectiveness, but it is designed to protect our operators from the extraterritorial impacts of sanctions, which, as you said, Justine, has quite a numbing effect for global operators. And they, rather than sometimes comply with the blocking statute requirements, are fearful of the consequences and then don't. So there have been other efforts as well to try and, I suppose, protect our business operators, because from a European perspective, what we do with sanctions is restricted to our EU community. It doesn't have extraterritorial impacts. The US, it is different. So we try and find ways of protecting our businesses, protecting their investments, but it is not easy. And I think, Justine, you, in the remarks you made, have highlighted how for global operators, they do have this difficulty in navigating a very difficult climate. We also had another mechanism where a few countries came together in STEX to try and, if you like, have the same effect or an added effect with the blocking statute. It has worked on one or two occasions, so it's very much a work in progress, and we are certainly always keeping an eye to see what we might do better. So the ideal would be that there wouldn't be extraterritorial impacts on our operators and that they could continue to do business abiding by EU law. But as Justine has just said, this is probably more a wish than a reality. And I'd be interested more to hear from both Justine and Adam how they see this evolve, because certainly from the businesses in the European Union, we want to protect them from these impacts because it really stops them doing business legally. And they're being stopped not by the European Union, but by other countries. So the consequences are very deep and very, very difficult.
Adam, would you like to talk a little bit about the consequences and some of your thoughts on the blocking statute?
I don't know that I have so much to add. I mean, I think the Commissioner McGuinness's points are very salient and are certainly quite relevant in a moment now. And I don't think we've touched on this yet, where you have China deploying extraterritorial sanctions as well. And so for third country companies, let's say a European company, an Australian company doing business in Hong Kong, you can very readily find yourself in a place of dueling sanctions or maybe even a conflict of law. Just to give a hypothetical, if you're supplying software to Hong Kong government authorities and that software is used by security forces, well, maybe you're targeted for sanctions under human rights laws in the US. But to cease providing those services or that software could subject you to Chinese or Hong Kong sanctions. And we're talking here about a third country firm. So dueling extraterritorial sanctions, that's a very challenging world to live in. And the Chinese sanctions architecture here is new, but it has been growing really rapidly. So there are 3 new laws in the last year that China has deployed, which could have extraterritorial sanctions consequences. And I think that's a challenge that is not going to be able to be addressed by any jurisdiction on its own, whether that's the US, the EU, the UK. I think it will really require an alignment of thinking and of concerted diplomacy. Ultimately, I agree with something Commissioner McGuinness said in her opening remarks, I believe, which is the best solution here is not going to be blocking statutes. It's going to be to bring about fundamental alignment in terms of our sanctions programs, which is something that when I was in government, we worked very, very assiduously at and achieved in many cases. So whether it's human rights, whether it was Iran, whether it was Russia, the US and the EU were moving in parallel. And the concerns that Justine is talking about then are dramatically reduced. If companies say, oh, I get it, there's sanctions that go to the Russian defense sector, and those sanctions are being put across the board by Canada, US, EU, UK, Australia. Okay, I know what I need to do. The extraterritoriality really comes up in its most sharp and bitter form when the transatlantic relationship breaks down.
Adam, if I can just ask you, put you on the spot just a little bit. We heard in the last few months, we've heard that the Biden administration, particularly at the Treasury Department, Janet Yellen wants to conduct a top to bottom review of Treasury's sanctions operations. That's looking at staffing, budgets, all of the portfolios. We haven't heard how long that might take, but I was just wondering, as a former senior Treasury official in that sphere in the agency, what you expect to hear and what you hope to see from that review.
Look, I'm not on the inside anymore, as you noted, so I don't have any special intelligence about what that review will look like. I think it's always healthy when there's a new administration coming in to take a close look and a look from a distance, because once the business of government gets going, you don't have that perspective, you don't have that time to reflect. So I think that's all to the good. In terms of what I would expect, I think we have heard certain principles that I think will emerge in that review. And the two most important are that sanctions are a tool or an instrument that needs to be used in service of a strategy. And so what's really important to watch isn't the sanctions review, but the other reviews that are going on in terms of how the Biden administration wants to meet the challenge from a rising China. What does the pivot to Asia look like? What are we going to be doing about Russia? And by we, I don't just mean the US. I mean the host of countries and jurisdictions, very much including the EU. What are we all going to be doing about things like increasing human rights abuses coming out of the Putin government? What about the coup in Burma, Myanmar? So all of those policy reviews, I hope, will be driving how sanctions are used, because sanctions are just an instrument towards an end. So a more strategic approach would be one. The second principle that I think will be very foundational here is multilateralism. And that's for a whole host of reasons. The most obvious is sanctions as an instrument are going to be exponentially more effective when they're used in a concerted way by the US alongside its allies. Ideally, when used by the UN Security Council, although there are many challenges there, as has already been noted. But multilateralism is also important in terms of reducing the frictions that Commissioner McGuinness spoke about, that Justine spoke about. So I think strategic use, multilateral use, and then there's a lot of details that would follow, but that's what I would see as the two tent poles of the review.
So to change our topic just a little bit, Justine, if I could direct this question to you. A former Treasury official has said to me that the best sanction is actually the one that never gets fully announced or issued, meaning the signaling and the signaling effect and the stickiness of possibly being sanctioned should do the trick. And I was wondering, in the private sector, which is essentially there to carry out these sanctions as a regulation, how do you handle this? How do you handle when Congress or an official is signaling that sanctions may or may not come, but those transactions are still allowed?
Well, there's certainly lots of conversations happening when that signaling is happening, that's for sure, and I think it really depends on what your relationship is with the person or the entity being signaled out, and also what is their connection. So there's some type of relationships which actually you can withdraw quite easy just on basis of risk appetite. It really does depend on what is your connection. Do you actually share those concerns? Are those concerns fairly broadly shared globally? Are they multilateral concerns? So you can then sort of protect yourself, and in a way that has the impact that the Treasury official was talking to you about, in that it has a soft coercion without actually following through on the sanctions. However, it does become really difficult where there is maybe not shared views or shared opinions. So where we see, for example, particularly around the Russia sanctions, we've seen this a lot, and where withdrawing could be quite complex, and particularly if it's in relation to strategic energy companies, for example, which have backing of individual governments or other types of strategic relationships, that can be really, really difficult. How do you manage that risk? And it sort of comes in a little bit into the risk of secondary sanctions, because as soon as that is floated, everybody really does look at it and they really start to say, okay, what's our exposure? Should we continue this relationship? What are the implications of leaving this relationship? Will we actually be sued because we're in breach of contract? Will we become in a very challenging place with another government? So it does depend. And I think it really also indicates on where that messaging is coming from. I mean, people are now really watch what's happening and being discussed in Congress very, very closely. And this is the other dynamic to looking at the transatlantic relationship. You have the relationship with the executive branch, but there's also the congressional side and what is driving Congress. who are they focused on? So we now as an organization spend an awful lot of time trying to keep our members updated around, what draft bills are in Congress. We recognize that many of those draft bills will not advance, but it gives an indication to what the concerns are, where the risks are. And we have seen a lot of these concerns coming up, particularly around Russia, but also when the maximum impact campaign on Iran was being branched up as well. We were getting very clear indications, both from Congress and the administration, on types of sectors which would be impacted, types of areas where we would potentially see new sanctions forthcoming, and people try and reduce their risk if they possibly can. So that does have a chilling effect. It does absolutely impact how global businesses will operate. And it can be legally very difficult because, sometimes withdrawing is not actually straightforward and is not always desirable either. So it is a very fluid and very dependent on the situation.
Commissioner McGuinness, if I could ask you for your view from the outside, how you digest and absorb comments from lawmakers in terms of sanctions on Russia or China or other countries that obviously will also impact the EU. Commissioner, I believe you're still muted.
I was just checking that you'd notice. But just to 3 points in relation to a general observation about multilateralism. I mean, the truth is that all of the global institutions are weaker than they should be. So there's a huge amount of work to go into rebuilding. World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, all of these institutions are there, and they're there for a purpose, but they're not effective and strong enough. So we have to, as well as keeping our relationships on the US side, we have to work together to try and strengthen them. And there has to be a willingness to do that. And then secondly, your point around what I'm hearing, I suppose there is also the need for us to talk to people where we have huge differences, where we absolutely disagree with what they are doing, and we have to find ways to make our point. And if we're not being listened to, we need to use sanctions in a way that makes that point for us. But you've mentioned Russia and China. All of these things are in play at the moment. So if you like, the mood music is quite difficult. And that's why listening to Justine about the practical implications for companies and businesses is really important for me as a policymaker to understand that. And equally to see how we might, with the US, do things together to be more effective. And indeed to do things that don't impact one on the other in a way which is negative. So these are all issues that still have to be worked out. But I think that is the big challenge always on the global stage, is how do we interact with those where we have huge differences, whether it's on human rights and other areas as well. To cut off contact doesn't work. To engage can be, challenging, but we have to find a way to do that. And of course, the idea of sanctions is really to show where we are prepared to take very strong action, where we're not seeing a response at the diplomatic level. And I think that's where we need to use the sanctions regime. And we also need to make sure that from a European point of view, and I made this in my opening remarks, we need to make sure that what we agree, and it is the ministers who agree to these sanctions, that in our role here in the Commission, we see that it is implemented effectively and that we are aware, if that is the case, where things are not working properly. So a lot of what we have discussed in our communication recently has been addressed to ourselves, so that we have to take responsibility that when we implement a sanctions regime, we follow up and make sure that it is effective on the ground. Where we are troubled, of course, is the point we've spoken about earlier, where we are impacted very directly by the actions of another player, and our businesses are caught in the crossfire and then become terrified of moving in either direction. And I think it's that chilling effect that we try and work very hard to resist, but we need to have this conversation in order for there to be an understanding of what it is like to be a player on the global stage, as the EU is, trying to protect our businesses from sanctions that are not of our making.
Commissioner McGuinness, there's another question for you from one of our viewers. So one of the major reasons why the U.S. Has sanctions that have succeeded is OFAC, which provides a single specialized bureaucracy for the Treasury Department to implement sanctions. Can you share with us how you think the EU can duplicate this kind of implementing organization, given the complex division of responsibilities across member states in the EU?
I mean, as a general point, sometimes I wonder how the EU actually functions. It's quite an unusual structure globally, and yet it has survived and it has strengthened in many different areas. So we do things differently because we have member states, we have a European Parliament, we have a Council, and then we have the Commission. So I don't think we can replicate what you've just described, but as we've done in the recent communication, we are acknowledging to ourselves that we need to strengthen our work in this area, which is why my remit now is to make sure that the sanctions that are agreed at political level take effect. And I think that is a good separation, if you like, because the political decisions are made. Then it is up to us here in the Commission with the services to make sure that they are being effectively and evenly implemented. And one of the areas we are working on is to make sure we have a system whereby we get information, call it whistleblowing, whatever the title, but we know that there is information out there that would help us implement more effectively. And that's a system that we are working to coordinate across our member states. So there is a very clear commitment from the EU side that where we take sanctions now, we will absolutely be very clear on implementation because I'm the commissioner responsible for that. So I don't think we need to replicate. We can certainly learn, but I think we know what we need to do internally to make sure that our regime works. And I think you will see already that is something that we are strengthening our resolve on this issue because I think both the US and the EU, we understand that sanctions have an effect. It's why we use them as a tool. If nothing else works, we need to have something that is strong, effective, and makes a very clear statement. But there's no point in having a political declaration unless it actually is implemented. So hence this, if you like, renewed, determination on our side to implement what we decide and to follow up where we know there is not full implementation. And that's something that I think will strengthen.
Adam, there's a question for you from one of our viewers. The difference between U.S. primary and secondary sanctions has been more and more nuanced. On the one hand, you have sanctions policies that in order to be effective, need to involve the whole global economy. On the other hand, the U.S. is going to increasingly need to graduate those policies to avoid the maximum pressure trap. I'm wondering, or our viewer, or one of our audience members is wondering what model will prevail in the future. Perhaps Iran could be the first chance to reaffirm the differences between primary and secondary sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think secondary sanctions pose an especially challenging, I would say, a challenging potential fissure for multilateral coordination for all the reasons that Commissioner McGuinness was saying, and therefore they need to be deployed with extreme care and only in the most exigent circumstances. The two guidelines that I at least would apply to this are first, is there already a strong multilateral consensus on the threat? And then second, are we using this only in the most extreme cases? Understanding that there's subjectivity to both of those, especially to the second. But when I was in government and we were hearing from Congress that they wanted to deploy very tough secondary sanctions that would go impose cutoffs from the US market on third country firms doing a whole range of business with Iran, we had a lot of questions and we had admittedly a number of concerns. Now, that was against a backdrop of multiple UN Security Council resolutions that showed global concern over Iran's nuclear program and a consensus that economic and financial pressure needed to be applied. Ultimately, I think what emerged from that discussion between the executive and Congress was strong and coherent and sensible in that you had secondary sanctions threatened against third country firms that were bucking an international consensus. that were willing to do trade or maybe go and run and pick up trade that large firms or large banks had given up because the globe was really unified when it came to this threat. But I and other executive branch officials expressed to Congress at the time the worry that what is today's ceiling when it comes to sanctions can very quickly become the floor, by which I mean the measure that's used as a in extremis, once in a generation, can often, in just a matter of years, become, well, your sanctions program isn't serious unless you've done X. And I think we've seen that to some extent with secondary sanctions, where they have been now applied across sanctions program to sanctions program to sanctions program. And I've seen comments from American lawmakers saying, if you're not using secondary sanctions, you clearly don't care about the issue. So that to me is not the right perspective on the issue. I do believe, as I said, we have to use these extremely sparingly, and only once we've brought or worked with other countries to obtain a consensus.
And to continue on the theme of secondary sanctions, Justine, there's a question for you from the audience. You mentioned the chilling effect caused by secondary sanctions. For European companies, the political risk and technical hurdles of doing business both in the US and China is growing. If the US continues expanding its sanctions against China, do you think that it could gradually lead to the decoupling of the Western and Chinese economies?
Oh, I mean, I think that is $1 million question, which actually everybody is really asking. And I don't actually have the answer to that, I have to say. And I don't actually think anybody has the answer to that at this very particular point in time. I think what we know is, you know, and I described this the other day, I think we're at a bit of a point of a game of chess here. You know, everybody's taken a bit of a pause with the change of US administration. The Chinese blocking regulation is actually very similar to the EU blocking regulation. It's taken a lot of elements from the EU blocking regulation, but they've not really yet used it. So the question really will be is, I think what's happening at the moment is China is really waiting to see what the next steps from the Biden administration will occur. And then they're looking at how they respond. Because I think what we know with the Chinese, how they respond will be very considered and very, very deliberate. They will look and take a lot of consideration on how it will impact their own actors and their own economies. And they'll also use a range of tools. They'll not just use the blocking regulation. They'll use tools around mineral exports, you know, sensitive goods exports, denied entities lists, as well as the blocking regulation. So for China at the moment, I think everybody's just sat back. We're pausing. It's been very interesting watching the Chinese military listed sanctions, which the US have brought forward. We've had aspects around close named matches, how to implement them. Industry has been really scratching their head, for want of a better description. That has been paused until May. It was supposed to be implemented in January. So the Biden administration has come in and gone, okay, where are we at? What are we going to do? But actually what I would say is, you know, they're expressing the same concerns as the Trump administration around human rights. You know, there's a lot of commonality, and it will really be around, will they then continue with that? And also, what do we see happening in Hong Kong with Hong Kong democratization and the concerns there, and whether we'll see an escalation of protests and then response from the authorities? Then in some ways, the US will feel compelled to act. And then the question really will be is, will the UK and the EU then also act as well? So it is a really unpredictable time at the moment. But, you know, the element around secondary sanctions, I would just really like to add on something which, you know, Adam said, is that secondary sanctions are now built into so many programs. You know, they are really very, very key in many ways. And it's actually, how do you then, how does the Biden administration take a review? And if they then want to roll that back and deal with some of the fear factor aspects, you know, how do they do that? So, I mean, we've talked about Syria, we've talked about China and Russia, but there are a lot of other regimes out there. If we look at Syria, for example, we have the secondary sanctions under the Caesar Act came in last summer. That is a country I do a lot of work with around humanitarian transactions, and including with the European Commission colleagues and indeed US colleagues as well. And, we did see a real chilling effect from the Caesar Act around humanitarian plus type of activities and concerns. So even when there is such a tiny aspect of you being caught by secondary sanctions, the chilling effect is still there. And it's to do with the uncertainty. And that's the element here, is where you have uncertainty, you then have the chilling effect. And that's what I would say for, just to add on to Adam's comments.
Commissioner McGuinness, while we have you, I think this is a great question for you from our audience. The EU and the US have been in conflict over Iran sanctions since former President Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. How important is it for the US to return rapidly to the JCPOA to resolve that conflict? And to add on to that, how can Europe protect itself better in the future against US unilateralism in terms of sanctions?
Well, look, I mean, we know the history of this issue. So, of course, we would like to see that the new administration would come back on board, and then that we wouldn't have this difficult issue to resolve. What's interesting when I listen to Justine is that we're only starting these conversations. I mean, the administration is just in. It's one of the reasons why we felt it was really timely for us to set out our agenda. So clearly, we would have aspirations that the US would get back on board and avoid the difficulties. When you ask me then, how do we protect our interests? Already I've made some comments around that. We do have instruments to try and do that, but it can be very difficult. And I think it speaks to the chilling effect that Justine refers to, that sometimes even with EU taking action to protect our own operators, the operators themselves are just too frightened because it has other implications for other aspects of their business globally. So this is a very, if you like, tangled web. So it's not just straightforward to talk about sanctions as having a particular impact. It has a much broader impact. But I think if we come back to brass tacks here, which is that sanctions are an instrument to, if you like, persuade in a strong way others to look at what they're doing. We regard it as a way to spread our values, whether it's democracy, human rights, the rule of law. And if it is implemented effectively, it should have that effect. And I think the fact that we're having this discussion this evening is really, really important to get us all working and thinking in a more collaborative way, so that we have probably the same objectives, but we want to make sure that the instruments we use achieve those objectives, or indeed don't have unintended consequences. And I think that's what Justine refers to in many cases, that businesses and operators know that these sanctions exist, but they're not quite sure how broad they are and what wider implications they have. So I think it's a really good time for us to start this conversation. There are so many issues globally where we have, from an EU and a US perspective, a shared interest in having a positive impact, that I would hope we would find the space with all of the other complications that we are living with and trying to cope with, but find the space to agree the shared agenda and look at how we can work together to achieve that, notwithstanding, which was the outset of my remarks, that there will be areas where the conversation will be tough. My real hope and my real belief is that we can have those conversations, because there's nothing worse than silence or no connection. I think now we have that space, and I think that there will be a much better engagement. And that's why I suppose from our side, from the EU side, we've also challenged ourselves to stand up. I mean, Europe is regarded globally, I think, as having strong soft power, and I think that is the case. And I think we need to be assertive about using that soft power at the global level, because we work really as a multilateral organization, as I've already said, by our very existence of having 27 member states.
So I think I'm going to give our final question to Adam before I hand everything back over to Julia for closing remarks. Adam, we have a great question from the audience on balancing the impact of sanctions on human rights, on the degradation of human rights, like we're seeing in Syria and Iran, in the COVID environment. How do you balance the impact of sanctions on how it can directly affect the local population?
Yeah, I mean, that is a tremendously important and challenging question. It ends up, in my experience, being very context and country specific. And the questioner doesn't mention Venezuela and North Korea, but they're just as apt, just as relevant to this question, where you have tremendous suffering by the people and where the damage from COVID in Venezuela has been, I understand, pretty severe. And I think we expect the same in North Korea. I mean, we always in our sanctions programs have drawn a bright line to say these are not covering and not prohibiting in any way the delivery of medicine, the delivery of medical devices, the delivery of food. And that's clear. And I think that's an issue where there's bipartisan agreement in the US. But that doesn't, as the questioner I'm sure knows, settle the issue. There are still challenges, and Justine was referencing some of them in Syria. Even where it's clear that certain trade is allowed, it doesn't mean it occurs. So what should the role of governments be in those situations? Well, in some situations, governments or the UN and the UN's agencies can actually be delivering assistance, could be delivering vaccines. That's where it becomes very context and country specific. How permissive an environment is it? How safe is it for UN agencies to go into Syria? Well, that might very much depend on what area of Syria we're talking about. In North Korea, there's going to be political terms that will have to be negotiated over the introduction of aid. Even food has been excluded at certain times. So it's really challenging. Nevertheless, it's extremely important. And I think the initial presidential directive, I think it was the first presidential directive from President Biden, actually called this question to the fore when it comes to COVID and ensuring that a COVID response can be achieved, notwithstanding the existence of various US sanctions programs. So that's a really good sign about how this current US administration sees the issue and sees the primacy of that question.
Can I just add on to that 20 seconds? Sorry, Adam, to jump onto your question here, but it's such an important one, because actually what it really does when you look at it at the humanitarian aspect, you really then start to have to unpack all the elements of sanctions. And that's when you realize how complex they are to navigate. Even with the general licenses and the policy statements, that actually applying them in practice is phenomenally difficult. And it is something we spend hours upon hours every week working through. It is not straightforward, and I get really frustrated when everybody always says to me, you know, we sort of allow humanitarian activity, and it's like, well, you only really allow it in certain ways and certain scenarios, and there's so many other elements which come in, and then people just again don't feel confident where there are the permissions. So I mean, just to sort of piggyback onto, you know, Adam's, you know, really excellent comments, but to conclude, I would say I actually think this is a really great area where we could see some serious transatlantic cooperation, and we're already seeing that. So I'm actually hopeful on this particular topic.
And I'm going to be really rude and jump in and say here, because I think even in this house we have this debate, because humanitarian aid is so vital, and particularly in COVID times. And I think, you know, we really need to work together on that, because we don't want to hurt those that are already disadvantaged. So, you know, I think it's a good topic to end on, and to have this consensus. It's, as I say, I have this discussion with my colleagues here all the time in the Commission. So certainly would love to keep that conversation open to get this right.
Thank you so much. I'll just jump in to say some final remarks here. I could ask you guys to continue on this line for hours, and I'm sure all of our participants would be happy to listen. And thank you so much to the Commissioner, to Adam, to Justine, and to Saleha for this fascinating panel. Also to some of our partners who I see are on the Zoom today. Maybe others are present, but the ones I see are UPS and Procter & Gamble. So thank you for your generous partnership. I'm going to spend one moment and plug a recent product that we have, going to some remarks about the interconnectedness of different sanctions programs globally. And this is a partnership we have with the data analytics firm Castellum AI. We're trying to streamline global sanctions implemented by various regimes around the world, and to account perhaps for the discrepancies in legal standard. Now, this is an ongoing project. It's, you know, we're just launching it now, but just to flag for anyone who's interested, this is our attempt to be helpful from the think tank side. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. Have a lovely afternoon and evening, everyone.